Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
Right before the cake came out, my mother leaned in, brushed imaginary lint from my shoulder with that fake performative tenderness she always pulled out at family gatherings, and whispered in a tone that somehow managed to be both sweet and suffocating. "Don't say a word about your promotion today, sweetheart. It's Kara's moment, okay?" And just like that, the air in the room felt heavier. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because there was no point in fighting. Not here, not now, not again. We were surrounded by 70 or so guests. Most of them Kara's friends from college, Pilates, her wedding planner's cousin's hairstylist's dog walker, all sipping white wine and cooing over centerpieces Kara probably hadn't even arranged herself. I nodded, biting down the sharpness in my throat, because that was the role assigned to me long ago. Be the polite one, the strong one, the one who knows when to shut up and smile. Kara's bridal shower was the kind of event that looked effortless in photos, but reeked of insecurity in person. Over-decorated, over-catered, and overcompensating for something nobody dared name. The backyard of my parents' home had been transformed into a pastel fairy tale, with floating floral installations, gold-trimmed drink menus, and personalized champagne flutes with bride vibes etched on them in looping calligraphy. Kara stood at the center of it all, wrapped in a white sundress that probably cost more than my first car. Her hair perfectly curled, her laughter slightly too loud, like she needed it to echo back and remind everyone she was happy. I watched her from across the yard, chatting with people whose names I'd never remember, and for a moment I felt the familiar twinge. Not quite jealousy, more like a dull ache from a wound that had never really healed. She was always the chosen one, the adored one, the one Mom gushed over at church potlucks and book clubs, while my successes were neatly folded away like old linens, acknowledged but rarely displayed. That morning, I had gotten a call from my boss. The kind of call that changes the trajectory of a career, the kind that should have been celebrated with champagne and long, joyful voicemails. I'd been promoted to vice president of strategy at a firm where most women never even made it to director. It was a win, a massive one. But when I told my mother, her first reaction wasn't excitement. It was concern, not about me, but about Kara. "Can we not say anything until after the wedding, honey?" she'd asked, her voice a shade too gentle, like she knew it was wrong, but was hoping I'd be the bigger person, again. "It's just, Kara's been really emotional about the attention lately, and you know how she is." I knew exactly how Kara was, so I agreed. I always agreed. Because making a scene wasn't my thing, because being the bigger person had become my prison. But as the afternoon wore on, as I watched Kara open gifts with exaggerated gasps, as people barely acknowledged me beyond the polite nods and housework small talks, something inside me started to shift. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was the kind of quiet clarity that creeps in after years of biting your tongue. A realization that perhaps silence wasn't virtue, but surrender. That maybe, just maybe, the only reason they never saw me was because I had stopped asking to be seen. And then it happened. A waiter, young, clean-shaven, nervous-looking, emerged from the kitchen carrying a large white box. He moved carefully, like he was holding a Fabergé egg. Everyone clapped, expecting a cute vanilla message like, "She said yes," or "bride-to-be." The room leaned in, iPhones hovering, Kara already smiling like she'd rehearsed the moment in her mirror. But the waiter stopped beside Kara, opened the box, and cleared his throat. I'll never forget the way he looked at the little card in his hand, then glanced around the crowd, like he was double-checking whether he should actually read it out loud. But he did. "Congratulations to the real boss of the year, Amanda. Promoted and powerful." Silence. Not the polite kind. The bone-deep, soul-crushing kind where 70 people forget how to blink at the same time. The clap that someone had started in reflex died mid-slap. Kara's smile froze. My mother's hand dropped from her glass, like someone had unplugged her. I could feel every eyeball in that garden slowly swivel toward me. The chatter stopped. The air shifted. And I just sat there, frozen, confused, my heart doing somersaults inside my chest. I hadn't ordered a cake. I hadn't asked for a message. I hadn't even mentioned the damn promotion. My name was on the cake. My title, my win, written in swirling pink icing smack in the middle of Kara's big day. The very thing I'd been ordered not to say, not to share, not to even think about too loudly, now read aloud to a crowd of pampered strangers by a trembling waiter with no idea what he'd just unleashed. Kara's jaw clenched. My mother looked like she might faint or scream or both. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't rush to explain or apologize or fix anything, because I didn't write that message. But someone did. And suddenly, I had a very strong suspicion who it might have been. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever been told to dim your light for someone else? Have you ever been asked to disappear? Just so another person could feel like the sun? Because I have. And let me tell you, the sun burns. The silence that followed the waiter's words hung in the air like wet laundry on a windless day, heavy, awkward, and clinging to every corner of that perfectly curated backyard, like a fog no one knew how to breathe through. Kara was still smiling, or at least attempting to. It was that brittle, glass-like grin she wore when something didn't go her way, but the cameras were still on. Her eyes darted to Mom, then to me, then back to the cake, as if searching for a cue, an answer, a scapegoat. On the other hand, sat motionless, not from guilt or embarrassment, but from sheer confusion mixed with a creeping awareness that this was no accident. I hadn't ordered any cake, let alone a custom one. And even if I had, and I mean truly, would I have done something that self-serving, that on the nose, on her big day? No, but someone had. And the question now thudded through my mind with the weight of a dropped piano. Who the hell wrote that? Mom was the first to move. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Kara's shoulder like she was steadying a vase about to fall off a ledge, and gave me that sharp, tight-lipped look, the one that screamed volumes without a single word passing her mouth. The look that had accompanied every "we'll talk about this later" growing up, every time Kara cried and I hadn't done anything, every time I had the audacity to succeed too loudly. She didn't say it, but the message was clear as hell. Fix it, now. But I didn't, not because I was being defiant, not yet, but because for the first time in my life, I was just as lost as they were. I didn't even know where the message had come from. My mind raced through every possibility, like an overworked detective sorting through suspects in a case that hit too close to home. The waiter, poor guy, looked like he wanted to dissolve into the grass. I just read what was written, he muttered, holding up the little card like it was a get-out-of-jail-free pass, and disappeared back into the house with the kind of urgency usually reserved for people escaping burning buildings. Guests started shifting uncomfortably. Some sipped their drinks like they hoped alcohol would erase what they'd just heard. A few looked at me, eyes wide with the kind of polite curiosity people save for train wrecks. Tragic, but just distant enough to be entertaining. Kara broke the silence with a laugh, brittle and tinny. "Well, that's weird," she said, her voice trying for amused, but landing somewhere closer to rattled. "Amanda, did you do this?" She asked it with a little laugh, like she expected me to laugh along, to diffuse it, to play along like the obedient older sister who always played peacemaker at family dinners. But something in her tone was off, accusatory, daring me to lie. I met her eyes and answered calmly, "No, I didn't. I didn't even know there was a cake message." And that was the truth. But the way she tilted her head, the way Mom's mouth twisted just slightly, told me they weren't convinced. Or maybe they didn't want to be. Maybe it was easier to believe that I'd finally snapped and tried to steal the spotlight than to consider the possibility that someone else, maybe someone in that very backyard, had orchestrated this little bombshell. Then a memory surfaced. A flicker, small but sharp. Last week, Kara had borrowed my phone, said hers had died and she needed to check an email about a fitting or some nonsense. I didn't think anything of it. We were at lunch. She was bubbly, chatty, too sweet in that overcompensating way she got when she'd done something wrong. At the time, I brushed it off, but now that moment reeked of something more. Because here's the thing about Kara. She's not stupid, not by a long shot. She knows how to play the long game, how to frame a story so she's always the damsel and I'm always the storm. What if she had sent the message? What if she'd planted the words, knowing full well they'd land like a grenade, and then positioned herself as the victim? What if this wasn't a mistake, but a setup? Aunt Cheryl, who'd been sitting in the shade with a mimosa and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else, caught my eye and raised an eyebrow. Not judgmental, not mocking, just curious. She was the only one who knew how things really worked in our family. The only one who had once whispered to me during a Thanksgiving cleanup, "It's hard being the responsible one, isn't it? The one no one throws a party for, but always expects to do the dishes." I moved toward the cake slowly, partly to buy time, partly to study it. The icing was flawless, piped professionally, not a last-minute scribble. Someone had planned this, paid for it, typed it out, authorized the damn words. "Mom, did you see the message before it came out?" I asked, trying to sound neutral. She shook her head, flustered. "Of course not. Why would I, Amanda? I thought we had an understanding." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, not with sadness, but with that self-righteous tone she wore. When she wanted to guilt me without ever saying the words out loud. The same tone she used when I didn't attend Kara's birthday 3 years ago because I was in the hospital with a ruptured appendix. Apparently, family priorities didn't bend for medical emergencies. Kara was still watching me, too closely, like she was waiting for a crack. But I didn't give her one, because something in my gut, that old familiar gut that had learned over decades how to read every passive-aggressive syllable in my mother's house, was telling me she had known. If not exactly what the cake said, then that something was coming. And maybe Kara had even hinted at it. Maybe she had wanted it, needed it, to make me look like the villain, the one who couldn't even let her have one day without turning it into a press release. And that's when I knew. If this was a setup, and all signs were beginning to point in that direction, then they had miscalculated one very important thing. I wasn't going to play dumb anymore. Let them think I planned it, let them whisper, let the room keep turning, because if they wanted me to be the villain, I might just show them what that actually looked like. By the time I slipped away from the patio and into the house under the pretense of checking on something, I don't even remember what, maybe the gift table, maybe my own sanity, the chatter outside had picked up again, brittle and uneven, the kind of small talk people use as a defense mechanism when they've just witnessed a moment they can't quite explain or, more importantly, don't want to have to acknowledge out loud. I could still hear the tight laughter and the clinking of glasses, that overcompensating background noise trying its best to patch the jagged tear that had ripped through the afternoon. And even though I wasn't the one who'd torn it, I could feel the fabric of the whole day sticking to me like static. Every awkward glance, every sidelong whisper, wrapping around me like a second skin. The hallway smelled like furniture polish and distant roses. The scent of a house that always looked perfect, but had more secrets than windows. I walked past the framed photographs. Kara at prom, Kara at graduation, Kara with mom and dad at her sorority fundraiser. And near the end, one single photo of me tucked into the corner of a dusty shelf. My college graduation, no cap, just me smiling awkwardly next to my advisor, because neither of my parents had shown up. They said something had come up with Kara that day. I don't remember what it was, probably another allergy attack or maybe just a bad breakup. Something that required full parental deployment while I stood on stage alone with a cheap diploma folder and a silent phone. It wasn't that Kara was evil. It was worse than that, really. She was just effortlessly adored. One of those people who never had to try to be the favorite because the universe, or at least our mother, had made up its mind long ago she was charming in that shiny, overstated way that worked wonders at brunch but wore thin when the bills came due. And for all her supposed fragility, Kara had the emotional precision of a surgeon when it came to controlling a room. She didn't yell or accuse. She implied. She planted seeds and let them grow. She cried at just the right volume. She knew how to be helpless without ever losing power. And if I was being honest with myself, I had spent most of my life cleaning up the emotional messes that her performances left behind. I poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen, not because I was thirsty, but because I needed to do something with my hands. That's when Aunt Cheryl appeared, unannounced, quiet as always, moving like someone who'd lived in 100 similar family dynamics and learned to read between the silences. She didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the counter and looked at me the way someone looks at a painting that reminds them of something painful they can't quite place. "I saw Kara on your phone last week," she said eventually, her voice low and steady, as if she were sharing a weather report, not a potential confession. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now? She let the sentence trail off, leaving me to fill in the rest, which I did easily and with a sudden rush of cold certainty that made my spine go stiff. Of course she had used my phone. Of course she had written the message. Maybe she hadn't planned for it to be read aloud. Maybe even she wasn't that reckless. But the intent was clear as glass, to plant a bomb and make sure it had my fingerprints all over it. She'd known I wouldn't dare speak about the promotion, not after Mom's whispered instruction, and by making it look like I had, she got to claim victimhood while keeping her hands clean. That's when I realized this wasn't just about the cake. This wasn't just a prank or an accident or even a sisterly misfire. This was the continuation of a game we'd been playing our whole lives. Only I had spent years thinking I was just a bystander, too noble or too tired to play, when in fact I had been a pawn on her board from the beginning. And the thing about pawns is, sometimes they reach the other side of the board and become something else entirely. I turned to Aunt Cheryl and asked, almost too softly, "Do you think she did it on purpose?" She hesitated, which said everything, then shrugged. "I think Kara doesn't like not being the most important person in a room," she said, "and I think you stopped apologizing for existing a little too late for her taste." The bitterness in my mouth turned to something else. Not quite rage, but a new kind of clarity. All my life, I'd been told to be quiet, to be kind, to be supportive. I had watched Kara lie and manipulate and cry her way out of every corner she backed herself into. And I had let it happen. I had kept the peace, smoothed over the damage, made excuses for her while she ran off with the attention and the praise. But now she had gone too far. She had tried to sabotage the one thing I had kept to myself. Not because I was selfish, but because I was told it wasn't my moment. And then she had twisted it into an accusation, made it look like I was the one who couldn't stand being ignored, who needed to steal the spotlight. No more. If this was a game, then it was time I stopped pretending I wasn't playing. I wasn't going to explode or cry or start a fight in front of Mom's hydrangeas and Kara's influencer friends, but I was going to respond. Not loud, not messy, but precise. Like her, but better. "You gonna let it go?" Aunt Cheryl asked, a faint smile tugging at the edge of her mouth. I set the empty glass down, straightened my shoulders, and met her gaze. "No," I said, not angrily, not bitterly, just firmly, "not this time." And in that moment, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Not to ruin the wedding, not to take over the day. No, that would be too obvious, too easy. I wasn't interested in blowing things up. I wanted her to feel it, subtle, elegant. I wanted her to see the look on everyone's face when they finally understood that maybe, just maybe, Kara wasn't the only one who could spin a story. Because if she thought I was dangerous when I stayed quiet, she hadn't seen anything yet. By the time I stepped back out into the garden, the temperature had dipped just enough for people to pretend they weren't still reeling from the cake fiasco. The kind of forced pleasantness that floats over events like these when everyone agrees, silently and with great discomfort, to pretend the uncomfortable thing simply never happened. Kara had resumed her throne near the makeshift floral archway, smiling for photos again, accepting compliments, soaking in the warmth like a cat perched in a patch of light. But I could see the slight tightness at the edges of her mouth, the way her eyes flicked toward me every few minutes, not in fear but in calculation, like a gambler checking to see if someone else was holding the winning hand. My mother had stationed herself beside her, hands gently resting on Kara's shoulder as if she were guarding a fragile vase from another earthquake, all while casting me glances that were more fragile than stern, the kind of looks meant to communicate that she was disappointed, but too delicate to explain why out loud. There was a particular kind of cruelty in being told all your life to be the strong one, the mature one, the quiet achiever, and then watching the same people who demanded your restraint reward someone else for her chaos. I had learned to swallow my victories whole, celebrate in silence, tuck my ambition under my coat like contraband. Also, Kara could shine brighter without ever having to earn it. And for a long time, I convinced myself that this was noble, that being the good daughter meant stepping aside gracefully, that I didn't need recognition because I was above it. But in that moment, watching her grin while people pretended the whole damn cake incident had been some hilarious fluke, I realized just how much I had mistaken self-erasure for grace. And grace, real grace, didn't mean disappearing. It meant showing up with dignity and tact, and not letting anyone confuse your silence for consent. So I waited. I bided my time while the mimosa station reopened and the music volume crept up again, and the Instagram stories resumed. I mingled politely. I smiled at people who hadn't bothered to ask me what I'd been up to for the last year. I even laughed once or twice, because sometimes, if you want your moment to land right, you have to let the air grow still again, just long enough for your words to make the walls shift. When the time came for toasts, a tradition my mother insisted on reviving for old time's sake, I could tell Kara assumed I'd pass, and to be fair, I nearly did. But then after a beat, when no one else stepped forward and the room began to murmur, I took the mic from the wedding planner's assistant with the kind of calm that draws more attention than theatrics ever could. I walked to the front where Kara sat, still half smiling, wine glass in hand, head tilted like she wasn't quite sure which version of me was about to show up. I didn't start with sarcasm. I didn't unload grievances. I began instead with a memory, one from our childhood, warm and vivid, a moment in summer when Kara and I had built a lemonade stand on the corner of our street, cardboard signs and plastic pitchers and all. I painted the picture slowly, letting everyone settle into the nostalgia of two little girls chasing quarters in sunshine, before adding the detail that Kara had, at the end of the day, taken all the money and told me I didn't need it because I was older and didn't care about dumb things like candy. It had been our first business venture, and my first real lesson in the economics of sisterhood. There were chuckles, soft, genuine ones. And Kara smiled, though it was tighter now. I saw her shoulders square just a little, her eyes scanning the crowd, as if gauging the temperature. I continued, weaving through other stories. The times Kara had convinced our parents to skip my recitals because she had a cold. The vacations that had shifted dates because of her social calendar. The quiet sacrifices wrapped in, "You understand, don't you, honey?" I never raised my voice. I never accused. I simply told the truth, dressed in warmth and affection, coated with just enough sugar to make it palatable. But each story chipped away at the pedestal, not by knocking Kara off it, but by showing the uneven ground it had always stood on. And then came the gift, the pièce de résistance. I had put together a photo album for Kara, a beautiful leather-bound collection of childhood snapshots, teenage misadventures, and early adulthood memories. But inside, tucked between the pages, was one particular photograph, a picture from Kara's 16th birthday, the day she had told everyone I forgot to show up, when in truth, I had been grounded for calling out her lie about a broken bracelet. I had found the photo buried in an old drawer, her blowing out candles, me standing in the corner, cropped from most versions of the image that made it onto the mantle. I had kept the original. I left that page blank, save for a simple caption beneath the photo. Sometimes the parts we cut out tell the real story. I handed her the album personally. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she took it, the smile now frozen into something unsure. People clapped. Kara hugged me, stiff and too fast. My mother avoided my eyes entirely, and as I stepped back, I leaned in and whispered into Kara's ear, soft enough that no one else could hear, firm enough that she couldn't mistake it. "I didn't order the cake," I said, "but I kept the receipt." She blinked, once, twice. Then her face shifted into that mask of practiced serenity, the kind she wore at ballet recitals when she missed a step and still wanted the applause. I walked away before she could respond, not out of dramatics, but because I didn't need to hear what she'd say next. Whatever it would be another performance. And I had stopped buying tickets a long time ago. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. There were no fireworks, no ruined weddings, no screaming matches on manicured lawns. It was quieter than that, sharper. A recalibration of power. A reminder that sometimes the best way to hold a mirror up to someone is to do it with a smile and let the reflection speak for itself. And in that moment, I didn't need anyone's applause. I just needed Kara to know the game had changed. The aftermath didn't arrive in a storm, not the way you might expect after a public unraveling, but rather in a steady, creeping quiet. The kind that seeps into a house once the music fades and the laughter drains from the corners like bathwater, circling a slow drain, leaving only the residue of something that had looked beautiful on the surface, but, when dried, revealed the grit underneath. Guests trickled out with the kind of reluctant politeness reserved for events that had ended awkwardly. They thanked Kara for the lovely day, complimented the food, made vague noises about keeping in touch, and then, as soon as the gate clicked shut behind them, released the breath they had been holding since the toast, no doubt ready to dissect every uncomfortable moment over text chains and wine. Kara vanished into the house not long after I handed her the album, her posture still proud, but her gait betraying the tension she was so desperately trying to contain. And I didn't follow her because I knew, instinctively, and with the kind of certainty that comes only from years of careful observation, that she would come to me, but only after she'd had time to craft a version of the story where she was still the protagonist. Mom fluttered around the patio with the exhausted energy of someone whose control, over a situation had slipped through her fingers like water, still attempting to smooth over the cracks with forced smiles and overpoured drinks, all while throwing me glances that bordered on wounded, as if I had betrayed some unspoken contract to keep the family myth intact. And I simply sat. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to just be in that space, no longer shrinking, no longer contorting myself to fit into the small, polite role they had always assigned me. And I didn't care if I looked smug or defiant or indifferent, because I wasn't performing anymore, and the quiet inside me felt not empty, but earned. It was hours later, after the staff had packed up the tables and Kara's high school friends had stopped pretending they were going to help clean, that the confrontation finally arrived. Kara came into the kitchen where I was rinsing a wine glass I hadn't even used, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes sharp but tired, as if she'd rehearsed a speech and was now debating whether to deliver it or scream instead. "You just had to make it about you," she said, not yelling, but with that distinct edge of venom she always coated in sugar around other people, but never bothered to hide with me. I turned slowly, drying my hands with a dish towel I didn't need, and looked at her without a trace of apology. "Funny," I said. "I was about to say the same thing to you." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you even talking about?" I studied her, the furrowed brow, the indignant flush creeping into her cheeks, the way she shifted her weight from one leg to the other, like she wanted to leave but couldn't stand not getting the last word. For a moment, I considered laying it all out. The borrowed phone, the cake message, the receipt I had quietly retrieved from the bakery's online order portal that afternoon while pretending to take a phone call, but I didn't, because this wasn't about facts or confessions. It was about truths we both already knew, and saying them out loud would only cheapen them. Instead, I said, "You got your day, Kara, just not the one you planned." She scoffed, brushing her hair back like she was trying to erase the entire conversation with one dramatic flick. "You've always hated that people liked me more." "No," I said, quietly but firmly. "I hated that you made me feel guilty for being good at things." That stopped her, just for a second. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to argue, but nothing came out. For a moment, we just stood there, two sisters who had grown up in the same house but had lived entirely different lives, both shaped and scarred by the same woman, the same expectations, the same quiet cruelties disguised as love. And maybe, in that silence, something passed between us that was closer to honesty than we'd ever managed in all our years of forced closeness. Or maybe not. Maybe she still thought I was the villain. But as she turned to leave, her voice barely a whisper, she muttered, "You're not as clever as you think." I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed what I needed to know. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet and the lights had dimmed, I sat on the guest bed scrolling through my email, partly out of habit, partly to distract myself from the slow exhale of tension, when I saw it. A receipt sent to my inbox, a confirmation from the bakery. The subject line read, "Your custom message has been confirmed. Thank you, Kara." She hadn't just used my phone. She had logged into my email. She had placed the order from my account, paid with a card saved on file, and never thought I'd notice. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I was shocked. I wasn't. But because there was something beautifully ironic about her leaving a digital trail that precise. Kara, who prided herself on emotional manipulation, had tripped over something as mundane as poor account hygiene. I didn't reply. I didn't forward it to anyone. I simply moved it to a private folder, titled it with the date, and let it sit there. A quiet monument to the moment I finally saw her for exactly who she was, and decided not to play along anymore. I didn't ruin her wedding. I didn't confront her in front of our parents. I didn't share the email or show the receipt or announce the truth like a courtroom drama, because that would have given her something to rally against. An enemy, a scapegoat, a role she loved playing. And I wasn't going to give her that. Sometimes the best revenge isn't explosive. It's the kind that sits in silence, in inboxes and photo albums and unsaid truths. The kind that lets the other person live with the knowledge that you know, and that you don't need to say a word. I left the next morning without saying goodbye, and as I drove away, windows down, the wind tugging at my hair, and the silence finally mine, I realized something important. Not everyone needs to hear your story to know it's true. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away with your head high, the receipt in your back pocket, and the knowledge that, for once, you didn't dim yourself to keep someone else comfortable. Let them believe what they want, because sometimes being seen as the villain is the only way to stop playing the victim.